The macabre case of the most evil Appalachian bride. Her terrifying sexual practices drove 3 husbands to their graves in just 4 years. That's what the people of Blackwater Hollow whispered in 1906 about Cordelia Thorne, the woman they called cursed, 3 marriages, 3 dead husbands, each death more mysterious than the last. The town said she practiced unnatural acts that drove good Christian men to madness and death. Church sermons denounced her deviant appetites. Mothers crossed themselves when her name was spoken. Sheriff Buck Coleman ruled each death an accident or suicide, but the rumors grew darker. Then Sarah Mae Whitfield returned home and found something the town didn't want her to see. Hidden in her dead father's journals were secrets about those 3 deaths. Secrets that painted a very different picture of who the real monster was. But some truths are buried so deep that digging them up can cost you everything, including your life. What really happened behind closed doors in Blackwater Hollow, and why was an entire town so desperate to destroy one woman's reputation? The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1906, sealed with trembling hands and desperate haste. Sarah Mae Whitfield set down her teacup in her Charleston boarding house parlor and recognized the familiar scrawl of her childhood friend Martha Henley before she even broke the wax. The contents made her blood run cold. "Sarah Mae, you must come home at once. Cordelia Thorne has returned to Blackwater Hollow, and the town has gone mad with fear and rage. They say she killed her husbands with unnatural practices, that she drove them to madness with her deviant appetites before sending them to their graves. 3 dead men in 4 years, and now she walks among us again like some cursed specter." The church bells haven't stopped ringing since Sunday, and Reverend Patterson preaches fire and brimstone about the horror of Babylon returned to corrupt our Christian community. But Sarah Mae, I remember what your dear father said about looking beyond the surface of things, and something about this feels wrong in my very bones. Please come. I fear what they might do to her. Sarah Mae had fled Blackwater Hollow 5 years earlier, unable to bear the weight of her father's sudden death in what everyone called a mining accident. Reverend James Whitfield had been the moral compass of their small Appalachian community, a man who spoke truth to power and comfort to the afflicted. His loss had shattered something fundamental in Sarah Mae's faith, sending her fleeing to Charleston, where she could teach school children and pretend the darkness of her mountain home couldn't reach her. Now, as the train wound its way through the familiar curves of the Blue Ridge Mountains, she found herself returning to a place that felt more like a fever dream than a memory. The autumn leaves blazed red and gold against the granite peaks, beautiful and terrible in their dying glory, and Sarah Mae couldn't shake the feeling that she was descending into something far more dangerous than she had left behind. Blackwater Hollow hadn't changed much in 5 years, though it felt smaller somehow, more suffocating. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, the same coal dust settled on everything like a gray shroud, and the same suspicious eyes followed strangers from behind curtained windows. But there was something new in the air now, a tension that crackled like electricity before a thunderstorm. Conversations stopped when Sarah Mae passed, and more than once she caught fragments of whispered words that made her skin crawl. "Unnatural acts," she heard Mrs. Pemberton mutter to her companion outside the general store. Poor Isaac Dalton, driven to madness by her wicked ways before he took his own life. 3 husbands dead, another voice added, and each one died screaming, they say. What kind of Christian woman buries 3 men before she turns 25? Sarah Mae found lodging at the Hollow's only boarding house, a grim establishment run by the widow Preston, who regarded her with the kind of suspicion reserved for tax collectors and traveling preachers. The room was small and cold, with a window that faced the forest where Cordelia Thorne was said to be living in her dead grandmother's cottage, exiled from decent society. That first night, Sarah May lay awake listening to the sounds of the mountain settling around her. Somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called its haunting cry, and closer to town she could hear the low murmur of men's voices gathering in the street. The sound made her uneasy, reminding her of her father's stories about vigilante justice and the terrible things that happened when fear overrode Christian mercy. She dressed quickly and crept to her window, peering through the thin curtains at the scene unfolding below. A group of perhaps 20 men had gathered in the street, some carrying torches, others clutching rocks and bottles. At their head stood Sheriff Buck Coleman, a man Sarah May remembered as being quick with his fists and slow with his compassion. His face was hard in the flickering light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She's a curse on this town," Coleman was saying. 3 good Christian men dead, and for what? To satisfy her unnatural hungers? The Lord himself commands us to drive out the corruption from among us. The crowd murmured its agreement, and Sarah May watched in horror as they began moving toward the forest path that led to the old Thorne cottage. She threw on her cloak and followed at a distance, her heart pounding as she witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The cottage stood in a small clearing, dark except for the faint glow of a single candle in the window. It looked abandoned, almost ghostly in the moonlight, with its sagging roof and overgrown garden. But it was clearly occupied, and when the first rock crashed through the front window, Sarah May heard a woman scream of terror from inside. "Leave or join your husbands in hell!" Sheriff Coleman shouted, hurling another stone that shattered the remaining glass. The mob surged forward, and Sarah May could see them throwing bottles and debris at the small structure, while a terrified figure cowered inside. But what struck her most was not the violence of the scene, but the calculated nature of it. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of community rage. This was organized intimidation, led by the very man sworn to protect all citizens of Blackwater Hollow. Sheriff Coleman stood back as his followers did the dirty work, his face showing not righteous anger, but cold satisfaction. When the mob finally dispersed, Sarah May waited in the shadows until she was sure they were gone. Then, despite every instinct screaming at her to return to the safety of her boarding house, she approached the damaged cottage. The door hung open, and in the flickering candlelight, she could see overturned furniture and broken glass scattered across the floor. "Hello?" she called softly. "Are you hurt? I want to help." A figure emerged from the shadows, and Sarah May's breath caught in her throat. The woman before her bore no resemblance to the evil seductress described in town gossip. Cordelia Thorne was small and fragile, with dark hair that had once been carefully styled, but now hung in disheveled strands around a face marked by fresh bruises. Her dress was torn, and her hands shook as she clutched a kitchen knife for protection. But it was her eyes that struck Sarah May most profoundly. They held the haunted look of someone who had endured unspeakable suffering, the same expression Sarah May had seen in her father's eyes during his final months when he spoke of injustices he felt powerless to address. "I remember you," Cordelia whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're Reverend Whitfield's daughter. You used to sit in the front pew during Sunday service before—" She trailed off, but Sarah May understood. Before her father died, before everything changed. "I remember you too," Sarah May said gently. "You taught Sunday school to the younger children. You were always so kind to them." The words felt inadequate, but they seemed to unlock something in Cordelia's expression. "That was before," Cordelia said, and her voice carried the weight of a woman who had watched her entire world crumble. "Before they decided I was the devil's bride." The next morning dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of mountain cold that seeped through walls and settled in bones. Sarah May had spent a sleepless night thinking about Cordelia Thorne's haunted eyes and the calculated violence she had witnessed. Something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that had been forced into the wrong places to create a picture that satisfied everyone except those who looked too closely. She made her way to her father's old house, a modest 2-story structure that had been left to her but remained empty since his death. The key still hung on the same nail behind the loose board on the back porch, exactly where Reverend Whitfield had always kept it. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and old books brought tears to her eyes. Everything remained exactly as he had left it, covered now in 5 years of dust and neglect. Sarah May had avoided this place during her brief visits home for the funeral and estate matters, unable to bear the weight of memories it contained. But now, with Cordelia's terrified face burned into her mind, she felt compelled to search for answers in the only place her father might have left them. If anyone in Blackwater Hollow had understood the truth about what was happening to women in their community, it would have been the man who spent his life ministering to the broken and forgotten. She began in his study, methodically searching through sermons and correspondence. Most of it was routine church business, letters from parishioners seeking counsel, notes for Sunday services about loving thy neighbor and caring for widows and orphans. But as she dug deeper into the desk drawers, she found a locked box hidden beneath a false bottom. The key hung on the same chain as her father's pocket watch, and her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were journals she had never seen before, written in her father's careful script, but containing entries that revealed a side of him she had never known. These were not the gentle meditations of a country preacher, but the anguished observations of a man watching his community tear itself apart while he struggled to find the courage to intervene. March 15th, 1902, she read. Called to the Henderson place again today. Lucy's arm is broken this time, though she insists she fell down the stairs. The bruises on her throat tell a different story. Spoke to Sheriff Coleman about investigating, but he says a man's home is his castle, and the law has no place interfering between husband and wife. How many times must I hear those words? How many women must suffer while good Christian men look the other way? Page after page revealed similar entries, a catalog of domestic violence that Sheriff Coleman consistently refused to address. Sarah May's father had documented case after case of women seeking help, only to be turned away by the very man sworn to protect them. Wives with broken bones and blackened eyes, daughters sold into marriages they were too young for, widows whose husbands had died under suspicious circumstances that were never investigated. But it was the entries from 1904 and 1905 that made Sarah May's blood run cold. Her father had begun writing about unspeakable acts committed in darkness, and his growing suspicion that the devil walks among us, but not where the people point their fingers. He mentioned meeting secretly with women whose stories were too dangerous to record in detail, women whose husbands were pillars of the community, but monsters in private. September 3, 1904, one entry read, Cordelia came to me after her first husband's death. Poor child, barely 20 years old and already bearing scars that tell stories no woman should have to live. She begged me to help her escape before they married her to another man, but what power do I have against the mine company and their arrangements? Isaac Dalton has already paid her father's debts and considers her part of the transaction. I fear what Thomas Brewer did to her was only the beginning of her suffering. The implications hit Sarah May like a physical blow. Cordelia had not been a willing participant in multiple marriages, but a victim sold from one abuser to another. Her father had known this, had tried to help, and had been systematically blocked by the very systems meant to protect the innocent. Later entries revealed that Reverend Whitfield had begun documenting evidence, collecting testimonies from women who trusted him enough to speak truth about their suffering. He had been building a case, preparing to expose what he called a network of evil that reaches into every corner of our community. But his final entries, written just weeks before his death, showed a man who had grown increasingly paranoid and fearful. "They know what I know," he had written in his last entry. "Sheriff Coleman warned me today that accidents happen to men who spread lies about good Christian citizens. He mentioned that mine accidents are particularly common for those who don't watch their step. I have hidden my evidence where Sarah May will find it if something happens to me. May God forgive me for not acting sooner, and may He protect her if she chooses to finish what I started." Sarah May's hand shook as she closed the journal. Her father's death had not been an accident. He had been murdered for trying to expose the truth about Blackwater Hollow's systematic abuse of women, and Sheriff Coleman had been at the center of it all. She made her way to the courthouse the next day, determined to examine the official records of the deaths that had destroyed Cordelia's reputation. But when she requested access to the files, she found Sheriff Coleman waiting for her in the records office, his expression cold and calculating. "Miss Whitfield," he said, removing his hat in a mockery of politeness, "I heard you were back in town, stirring up old memories. Some stones are better left unturned, especially for a young woman living alone." "I have a right to examine public records," Sarah May replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Coleman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "These particular records contain details unfit for decent folk, especially delicate ladies like yourself. Details about the unnatural acts that drove 3 good men to madness and death. Surely you don't want to soil your mind with such filth?" "Those files belong to the people of this county," Sarah May insisted. "You have no authority to deny access." The sheriff stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cold calculation in his eyes. "Your father thought the same thing," he said quietly. "Poor man, always poking his nose where it didn't belong. Mining accidents are terrible things, Miss Whitfield. A man can be walking along, minding his own business, and suddenly find himself at the bottom of a shaft with his neck broken. Tragic, really, especially when it happens to someone who should have known better than to meddle in affairs that weren't his concern." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had made similar warnings before and followed through on them. Sarah May understood that she was not just investigating 3 suspicious deaths, but challenging an entire system of corruption that had successfully buried inconvenient truths by destroying anyone brave enough to speak them. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, she realized that pursuing justice for Cordelia Thorne might cost her everything, including her life. But her father's words echoed in her mind, written in his careful hand during his final days. Sometimes, he had noted, the truth was worth dying for. The question now was whether Sarah May had the courage to follow in his footsteps, knowing where that path had led him. Sarah May understood that direct confrontation with Sheriff Coleman's system would only lead to her own destruction, so she adopted the patient methods her father had used in his pastoral work. She began visiting the older women of Blackwater Hollow under the pretense of paying respects and catching up on community news. But her true purpose was to listen for the spaces between their words, the hesitations and glances that revealed truths they dared not speak aloud. Her first breakthrough came from Agnes McBride, a widow in her 70s who had been her father's most trusted confidant. Agnes lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, far enough from prying eyes that conversations could flow more freely than they might in the general store or church parlor. When Sarah May mentioned Cordelia's name, Agnes's weathered hands stilled on her knitting needles. "That poor child," Agnes whispered, glancing toward her windows as if Sheriff Coleman might materialize from the forest. "What they say about her ain't the whole truth, not by half. Your daddy knew it, and it's what got him killed, God rest his soul." Slowly, carefully, Sarah May drew out the real story of Cordelia's marriages. Thomas Brewer, The mine foreman who had been Cordelia's first husband was known throughout the camp for his violent rages and treatment of the women in his life. Agnes remembered how Cordelia would come to church services with bruises carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars, how she flinched whenever men raised their voices, how she seemed to shrink into herself whenever Thomas was mentioned. He had unnatural appetites. "All right," Agnes said bitterly, "but not the kind the preachers rail about from their pulpits. Thomas liked to hurt things, especially things that couldn't fight back. The things he demanded of that poor girl, the positions he forced her into, the degrading acts he called his marital rights. She tried to satisfy his twisted desires, hoping it might keep him from beating her, but it only made him hungrier for worse things." The second husband, Isaac Dalton, had been cut from the same cloth as Brewer, a merchant with a respectable facade who behind closed doors revealed appetites that grew more violent and degrading with each passing month. Agnes had seen Cordelia shopping for supplies with rope burns around her wrists, had noticed how she jumped at sudden movements, and seemed constantly on edge. "Isaac died of a heart attack," they said. "But I know the truth of it," Agnes continued. "He was forcing himself on her when his heart gave out, right there in their bedroom, while she fought beneath him. Poor child had to lie under his corpse for hours until someone found them, and still they blamed her for driving him to such passion that it killed him." The third husband, Jeremiah Polk, had been the worst of all. A land speculator with political connections who had purchased Cordelia like livestock to satisfy debts her previous husband had accumulated. Polk had been known for his collection of obscene photographs and his habit of entertaining other men with detailed descriptions of his wife's humiliation. Agnes spoke in hushed tones about the sounds that came from the Polk house at night, the screams that neighbors learned to ignore, the way Cordelia had begun to look more like a ghost than a living woman. Jeremiah made her do things no Christian woman should even know about, Agnes said, her voice breaking. He would invite his friends over to watch sometimes, treating her like some kind of performing animal. When he died from that poisoning, folks said she finally snapped and murdered him. But I know different. The man was forcing her to prepare meals with her own hands, tied behind her back, making her eat scraps from the floor like a dog. When she finally tried to run away, he caught her and made her cook his dinner as punishment. But his own cruelty killed him that night. He was so drunk and angry that he forced spoiled meat down her throat, then ate the same tainted food himself when she vomited it back up. Divine justice, if you ask me. Each conversation with the older women revealed new layers of horror, a systematic pattern of abuse that had been carefully hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. Sarah May learned that Cordelia's reputation for seducing men was actually the result of her desperate attempts to survive by giving her tormentors what they demanded, hoping that compliance might spare her worse treatment. The unnatural acts whispered about in church circles were not evidence of her corruption, but proof of the depraved creativity of the men who owned her. But Sarah May's most important discovery came when she found additional correspondence hidden in her father's papers, letters exchanged with Dr. Edmund Hartwell in the county seat, who had examined Cordelia after each husband's death. Dr. Hartwell's medical reports, written in the careful language doctors used when documenting sensitive matters, painted a picture of systematic torture that made Sarah May physically ill. Patient exhibits extensive scarring consistent with repeated trauma, one report read. Evidence of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and psychological distress. Physical examination reveals injuries incompatible with consensual marital relations. Recommend immediate removal from current environment, though patient refuses to identify source of trauma. Another report, filed after Isaac Dalton's death, was even more explicit. Patient presence with evidence of sustained sexual assault, including internal injuries requiring surgical intervention. Rope burns on wrists and ankles suggest prolonged restraint. Patient exhibits symptoms of severe psychological trauma, including dissociation and inability to maintain eye contact with male medical staff. As Sarah May continued her investigation, she became aware that she was being watched. Sheriff Coleman's deputies began appearing wherever she went, lurking outside homes she visited, following her through the streets with barely concealed menace. Several women who had spoken to her previously suddenly became unavailable, claiming illness or family obligations when she tried to arrange meetings. The pressure intensified when Sarah May was summoned to a meeting with the school board, ostensibly to discuss her potential employment as a teacher, but actually to deliver a warning wrapped in bureaucratic language. The mine company, which employed most of the town's breadwinners, had expressed concerns about her activities and their potential impact on community morale. If she continued to spread what they called malicious gossip about respected deceased citizens, her teaching position would be terminated, and she would find it difficult to secure employment anywhere in the region. Anonymous threats began appearing under her door, crude drawings and messages that made their meaning unmistakable. Someone had been watching her movements carefully enough to know her daily routines, and the knowledge that she was being stalked by unknown enemies made every shadow seem threatening. The breaking point came when Sarah May finally confronted Cordelia directly, cornering her near the creek where she came to wash her meager possessions. Cordelia's reaction to being approached was pure animal terror, and she collapsed to her knees sobbing before Sarah May could even speak. "Please," Cordelia begged, "I never asked you to help me. I never wanted anyone else to die because of what I am." "What you are is a victim," Sarah May said firmly. "Tell me the truth, Cordelia, all of it. What really happened with your husbands?" What poured out of Cordelia in the next hour was a litany of abuse so systematic and brutal that Sarah May wondered how any human being could have survived it. Sold to Thomas Brewer at 16 to pay her father's gambling debts, Cordelia had endured 4 years of escalating violence and sexual torture before his heart attack freed her. But freedom had lasted less than a month before Isaac Dalton purchased her father's remaining debts and claimed her as payment. When Dalton died, Jeremiah Polk had stepped forward to assume ownership of both the debts and the woman, treating her as property to be used for his entertainment and that of his associates. "I tried to run," Cordelia whispered. "After each one died, I tried to disappear into the mountains. But Sheriff Coleman always brought me back. He said I belonged to whoever paid my father's debts, and there was always another man ready to take ownership. They all knew what the previous husband had done to me, and they all wanted to try the same things for themselves." The full scope of the conspiracy became clear to Sarah May over the following days as she pieced together fragments of testimony from women too terrified to speak openly. What she had initially believed to be 3 isolated cases of domestic violence was actually the visible tip of a much larger system of oppression that reached into every corner of Blackwater Hollow's power structure. The mine supervisors who arranged marriages to settle debts, the town officials who ignored complaints about missing women, the church elders who preached submission while turning blind eyes to obvious abuse, and Sheriff Coleman, who served as the enforcer, ensuring that victims remained silent and isolated. Her father's hidden journals revealed that he had identified at least a dozen other cases similar to Cordelia's, women who had been sold, traded, or abandoned to men who treated them as property rather than human beings. Some had disappeared entirely, their absences explained away as runaways or visits to distant relatives that never ended. Others had died under suspicious circumstances that were never investigated, their deaths attributed to accidents or illnesses that coincidentally occurred after they had begun seeking help. The system was as elegant as it was evil. Men with money or influence could acquire women through manufactured debts, knowing that Sheriff Coleman would enforce their ownership and return any who tried to escape. The community's silence was maintained through a combination of economic dependence, social pressure, and carefully orchestrated fear. Anyone who questioned the arrangement too persistently would find themselves facing accusations of moral corruption or political subversion. Their reputations destroyed and their livelihoods threatened until they learned to look the other way. Sarah May understood now why her father had been killed. His final journal entries revealed that he had been preparing to expose the entire network, armed with detailed testimonies from multiple victims and financial records showing how the mine company facilitated these transactions. He had planned to take his evidence to federal authorities in Charleston, bypassing the corrupted local law enforcement entirely. But someone had learned of his plans, and the mining accident that claimed his life had been carefully orchestrated to look like the result of his own carelessness. The realization that she was fighting not just individual criminals, but an entire system designed to protect them, filled Sarah May with a despair deeper than anything she had experienced since her father's death. How could one woman, armed only with hidden journals and whispered testimonies, hope to challenge something so pervasive and well-established? Every institution she might have turned to for help was either complicit or powerless against the network's influence. Her despair deepened into terror when she returned to her father's house one evening to find that his study had been ransacked. The hidden journals were gone, along with the medical reports from Dr. Hartwell and every other piece of evidence she had carefully assembled. Someone had entered her home with keys or lockpicks, searching with professional thoroughness until they found what they were looking for. They had left behind a single message, written in red ink across her father's Bible: "Stop spreading lies about good Christian men." Sarah May spent that night barricaded in her room, clutching a kitchen knife and listening to every sound in the darkness. She had underestimated the reach and sophistication of the forces she was challenging, and now she understood that they had been watching her every move, cataloging her discoveries, and waiting for the right moment to silence her permanently. The attack came 3 nights later, as she walked home from a late visit with Agnes McBride. 4 men in cloth masks emerged from an alley, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had done this before. They didn't speak as they surrounded her, but their intentions were clear from the rope and gag one of them carried. Sarah May screamed and fought with desperate fury, managing to break free and run toward the town square where her cries might be heard. She made it as far as the church steps before they caught her, dragging her into the shadows between buildings where her screams would be muffled by stone walls. The beating that followed was methodical rather than passionate, delivered by men who wanted to send a message without causing permanent damage that might raise questions. When they were finished, their leader leaned close enough that she could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "You're going to stop digging up dirt about men who can't defend themselves," he said, in a voice she recognized but couldn't quite place through her pain and fear. "You're going to pack your bags and go back to Charleston where school teachers belong. And if you ever come back to Blackwater Hollow with more lies and troublemaking, we'll finish what we started tonight. Your daddy learned that lesson too late. Don't make the same mistake." Sarah May crawled home through back alleys, her body battered and her spirit broken by the knowledge that she was completely alone against forces too powerful for her to comprehend. When she finally reached her father's house, she found another shock waiting for her. Cordelia Thorne lay unconscious on the kitchen floor, an empty bottle of laudanum beside her, and a note written in shaking handwriting. "I cannot bear knowing that more good people will suffer because of what I am," the note read. "Sarah May tried to help me, but I am beyond help. My very existence brings death and pain to anyone who shows me kindness. Perhaps if I am gone, the evil that follows me will die too. Please forgive me for being too weak to endure what God has given me to bear." Sarah May knelt beside Cordelia's barely breathing form, feeling for a pulse that fluttered weak and irregular beneath skin that had grown cold and clammy. She managed to get water down Cordelia's throat and induce vomiting, purging some of the poison from her system, but the woman remained unconscious and dangerously close to death. As Sarah May sat vigil through the longest night of her life, she found herself reading from her father's Bible, seeking comfort in familiar passages that now carried new meaning. Her father had underlined verses about justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, about defending the cause of the weak and fatherless and maintaining the rights of the poor and oppressed. But scattered throughout were other markings she had never noticed before, passages about the cost of speaking truth to power, about the suffering that came to those who challenged corrupt systems, about the patient work of building righteousness in places where evil had taken root. As dawn broke over Blackwater Hollow, Sarah May realized that her father's true legacy was not the sermons he had preached from his pulpit, but the risks he had taken in private to protect the vulnerable and document the truth. He had known that his work might cost him his life, but he had continued anyway because he understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Now, sitting beside Cordelia's unconscious form with her own body aching from the beating she had received, Sarah May faced the same choice her father had made. She could flee to safety and let the system continue destroying innocent lives, or she could find another way to fight back, even if it meant accepting that the cost might be everything she had left to lose. Cordelia survived the laudanum poisoning, though she remained weak and disoriented for days afterward. As Sarah May nursed her back to health, a profound transformation occurred in her own understanding of what justice meant in a world where the systems meant to protect the innocent were themselves corrupted beyond redemption. She stopped trying to prove Cordelia's innocence to people who had already decided she was guilty, and instead focused on something more fundamental, ensuring that one broken woman could find peace and safety, even if the men who had destroyed her faced no earthly consequences. Sarah May began quietly selling her father's rare books and theological texts, items that had seemed precious when she thought of them as his legacy, but now revealed their true value as tools for Cordelia's salvation. A first edition of Calvin's Institutes brought enough money to secure passage to Charleston and several months of lodging, while her father's annotated Greek New Testament funded letters of introduction to women's charitable organizations that operated refuges for those fleeing dangerous situations. Through careful correspondence with contacts her father had maintained in the larger world beyond Blackwater Hollow, Sarah May arranged for Cordelia to disappear completely, taking on a new name and identity that would allow her to begin again where no one knew her as the cursed widow who had buried 3 husbands. The plan required perfect timing and absolute secrecy, but Sarah May had learned patience from watching her father build his hidden network of evidence and allies. On Cordelia's final Sunday in Blackwater Hollow, Sarah May did something that surprised even herself. She walked into her father's church during evening service, moving past Reverend Patterson's startled protests and taking her place at the pulpit where her father had once preached truth to a congregation that preferred comfortable lies. The church fell silent as she opened his Bible to passages he had marked throughout his ministry, verses about justice and mercy that suddenly carried new weight in the context of what the community had allowed to happen. My father stood in this place for 20 years, speaking about love and forgiveness and the Christian duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves, Sarah May began, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. Tonight I want to talk about how a community can become so afraid of uncomfortable truths that it chooses to sacrifice innocent people rather than confront the evil in its midst. She spoke not of Sheriff Coleman by name, nor of specific crimes that could be proven in court, but of systems that allowed powerful men to hide their cruelty behind respectable facades while their victims were transformed into monsters through gossip and willful blindness. She talked about how fear of scandal could make good people complicit in terrible acts, how the desire to preserve social order could become more important than preserving human lives, and how the silence of the righteous enabled the triumph of evil. When we decide that some people are worth sacrificing for the comfort of others, she said, looking directly at faces she had known since childhood, when we choose to believe lies because the truth requires us to act, when we demonize victims to avoid confronting perpetrators, we become something less than the Christians we claim to be. The sermon lasted only 20 minutes, but its effects rippled through Blackwater Hollow like stones thrown into still water. Sheriff Coleman and his allies moved quickly to have Sarah May arrested for disturbing the peace and spreading malicious gossip, but something had shifted in the community's willingness to accept their authority without question. Women who had remained silent for years began whispering to each other about their own experiences, sharing stories that painted patterns too consistent to dismiss as isolated incidents. Within a month, 3 wives had left abusive husbands and sought refuge with relatives in neighboring towns. 2 mine supervisors found themselves facing questions about financial arrangements that had previously been considered private business matters. When the mine company's executives in Richmond learned that their local operations were becoming associated with scandal involving the systematic abuse of women, they moved swiftly to transfer Sheriff Coleman and several other problematic employees to remote locations where their activities would draw less attention. Cordelia departed for Charleston on a gray morning in November, leaving behind a letter that Sarah May found tucked beneath her father's Bible. In it, she revealed the location of evidence her tormentors had never suspected she possessed: detailed records of financial transactions, photographs taken without the subject's knowledge, and testimony written in her own hand during moments of lucidity between periods of abuse. The evidence was damaging enough to destroy several powerful men, but Sarah May made the calculated decision to secure it rather than expose it immediately, understanding that lasting change required careful strategy rather than dramatic gestures that might provoke a violent backlash. "I am not seeking revenge," Cordelia had written, "only the assurance that if these men try to create new victims, someone will have the power to stop them. Use this knowledge as my father used his sermons to protect those who come after, rather than to punish those who came before." Sarah May accepted the position of schoolteacher that had been offered to her, but approached her role with a fundamentally different understanding of her purpose in Blackwater Hollow. She saw herself now not merely as an educator, but as a guardian of truth, responsible for teaching her students to question accepted narratives and stand up for those society had decided were worth sacrificing. Her classroom became a place where children learned to think critically about the stories they were told, to recognize the difference between justice and vengeance, and to understand their responsibility to protect the vulnerable. She established a quiet network among the women of the community, creating spaces where they could speak safely about their experiences and document abuses that might otherwise be forgotten or dismissed. The network operated without formal structure or public acknowledgement, but its influence grew steadily as women discovered they were not alone in their struggles and that silence was not their only option for survival. The transformation was neither complete nor immediate. Many of the men who had enabled the system of abuse remained in positions of power, and the fundamental structures that had allowed such corruption to flourish were still largely intact. But something essential had changed in the community's willingness to question authority and protect its own members, particularly those who had previously been voiceless. Sarah May kept her father's Bible open on her desk to his favorite verse about justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. She had learned that truth, like water, would eventually find its way around any obstacle, wearing down even the hardest stone through patient persistence. The work of building a more just community would take generations, but it had begun with the simple recognition that some people were worth protecting even when doing so required courage and sacrifice. Years later, when former students returned to visit their teacher, they would find her still at her desk, still teaching children to think for themselves, still keeping watch over a community that had learned the hard lesson that evil triumphs not when good people do evil things, but when good people choose to do nothing at all. The town had not become perfect, but it had become conscious, and that consciousness was the foundation upon which all other change would eventually be built.